Now that you have an understanding of what HMS Core AppTouch is, let's move on to the HMS Core Kit Practice Camp. In this part, I'll walk you through the preparations you need to make before development and how to integrate Account Kit and IAP, which you're mostly concerned about, and some common problems you may encounter. Preparations mentioned here include creating an app in AppGallery Connect, integrating the HMS Core SDK, and configuring the carrier ID for the app.
On the App Services page of Huawei Developers, click AppGallery Connect. Click My Projects, add a project, enter the project name and click OK. After the project is created, click Add App. Set app name and package name. Set app category and default language, and then click OK. After the app is created, a wizard for integrating the base SDK package is displayed. This wizard will walk you through how to add a configuration file, Maven repository address, and AppGallery Connect plugins. Finally, set SHA-256 certificate fingerprint. After the app is created on Huawei Developers, use the development tool to create a project and integrate the HMS Core SDK into this project. Go to File, New Project. Configure app information and click Finish. After the project is created, download the AG Connect Services JSON file from the Huawei Developers and place the file in the app directory. Open the Build Gradle and Settings Gradle files in the root directory of the project and configure the Maven repository address of the HMS Core SDK. Open the Build Gradle file in the app directory, add the AppGallery Connect plugin configurations to the plugins block, and add the dependencies of Account Kit and IAP to the dependencies block. If AppTouch has not been installed on mobile phones, use GameTest to set the carrier ID for the app and set app ID, app package name, carrier ID, and home country. Now, let's take a look at how to use GameTest. Open GameTest. Click to B2C. Modify app ID and app package name. Change the value of AppTouch package name to COM HUAWEI AppTouch. Modify carrier ID and home country, and then click Set App Info. When all these preparations are done, we can start integration and coding. I'll be introducing sample code in your app and how to simulate requests on your server using Postman. Your app mainly implements two functions. The first is to dynamically obtain the sign-in icon and its name. The second is to obtain user authorization and show authorization code and carrier ID after explicit or silent sign-in. Initialize the account auth service object in the getAppTouch icon method of the main activity class. Call the getChannel method of the account auth service object. Add the onSuccessListener and onFailureListener methods. The account icon object will be returned in onSuccessListener. Call the getIcon and getDescription methods of the account icon object to obtain the sign-in icon and its name. Now let's run the app and check the effect. You can see that the sign-in icon and its name are correctly displayed. The exception object is returned if onFailureListener is triggered. You can forcibly convert the exception object to the API exception object and call the getStatusCode method of the API exception object to obtain the error code. Next, I'll show you how to sign in and obtain the authorization code and carrier ID. First, create the account auth params object. Add the authorization code and carrier ID methods when creating the account auth params object. Next, initialize the account auth service object and call the silent sign-in method of the account auth service object for silent sign-in. Then implement the onSuccessListener and onFailureListener methods. The auth account object will be returned in onSuccess. Call the getAuthorizationCode and getCarrierID methods of the auth account object to obtain the authorization code and carrier ID respectively. After obtaining the authorization code and carrier ID, your app sends them to the app server. If silent sign-in fails, onFailureListener is triggered. If an error code, for example 2002, is returned, call the getSignInIntent method of the AccountAuthService object to perform explicit sign-in. After explicit sign-in is successful, onActivityResult is triggered to pass data and obtain the task object. Call the isSuccessful method to check whether sign-in is successful. After a successful sign-in, call the getResult method to obtain the auth account object. You can call the getCarrierID and getAuthorizationCode methods to obtain the carrier ID and authorization code, respectively. The coding is complete. Let's take a look at the running effect. Run the project. Click the Sign In button. On the page that is displayed, tap Authorize and Login. Then you can view the authentication code and carrier ID. After that, you'll go through 4 steps to let your server obtain account information. Step 1. Use carrier ID to obtain the URL of the AccountKit server. Step 2. Access the AccountKit server and obtain the access token based on the authorization code. Step 3. Access the AccountKit server and pass the access token to obtain the unique user ID. Step 4. Access the AccountKit server to obtain the user information, such as the profile picture and nickname. Next, we'll use Postman to simulate a request. Before that, let's have a look at the document about obtaining the Kit server URL. The Kit server URL consists of the value of root URL and OpenRS server URL. We can open the site information page to check the value of root URL. The 4 different values of root URL represent the global site, China site, Asia site, and Europe site, respectively. A request consists of a request header, request query strings, and a request body. Now, let's use Postman to simulate a request. First, copy the server URL at the Asia site to Postman. Then, add the OpenRS server URL, carrier ID whose value is 502, and client ID to the end of the URL. You can obtain the client ID from the project settings page of AppGallery Connect. Next, change the request method to POST, and then change the type of the request body to JSON. Lastly, add the request body and click Send to send the request. After the request is sent, we can find the information such as token, token info, and user info. The value of token obtained in the response is the URL of the access token. Let's open Postman again. Click the URL of token to create a tab page. Use OAuth2 v3 token to complete the URL and change the request method to POST. Next, set the request body to the form format. Then, add the request parameters grant type, client ID, client secret, code, and redirect URI. Now let's set grant and client ID. The value of client ID can be obtained from the project settings page of AppGallery Connect. Then set client secret, whose value can also be obtained from the project settings page of AppGallery Connect. The next one is code. This is the authorization code you've obtained. The last one is redirect URI, whose value should be identical to that set in AppGallery Connect. Click Send to send the request. After the request is sent successfully, view the access token. You can pass it to obtain the unique user ID. The URL of the access token is the value of token info obtained in the first response. Let's open Postman and click the URL of token info to create a tab page. Then, use the API URL provided in the document to complete the URL and change the request method to POST. Next, set the request body to the form format. Add access token and OpenID. Enter the access token obtained in the second response and OpenID respectively. Click Send to send the request. After the request is sent successfully, check OpenID and Union ID. The URL for obtaining user information is the value of user info obtained in the first response. Let's open Postman and click the URL of user info to create a tab page. Then, use the API URL provided in the document to complete the URL. Change the request method to post and set the request body to the form format. Next, add access token and get nickname. Enter the access token obtained in the second response. Then set get nickname. Click send to send the request. After the request is sent successfully, check the user information. We have now finished the integration practice on AccountKit. Let's start with IAP. For the device side, we need to perform several steps to start AppTouch checkout. Open the IAP demo downloaded from the official website. Replace the package name, signature, and fingerprint with your own ones. They have been configured in AppGallery Connect in advance. Step 1. Call the queryIsReady method in entry activity on the app homepage. This method requests the isEnvironmentReady method of IAP. If your app is distributed on AppTouch, you need to open the IAP request helper class and pass true to isEnvironmentReady when it is called. This modification is crucial to the entire process. Then, we can obtain the carrier ID in isEnvironmentReady result from onSuccess. Step 2. Add the IDs configured for required products, in this case consumables, in PMS to our code. Open PMS and check the 5 products that were configured in advance. Obtain the product ID, price, name, type, and status for each product. Note that only activated products can be displayed and purchased. Click Consumables. The consumables created in PMS are displayed in a list view. Step 3. Click the apple to open the checkout page. A payment agreement is displayed for you to confirm before the checkout page is called. After that, a risk warning appears due to the test device routed. After you choose to continue, the checkout page using a payment method of the carrier will appear, which is different from the checkout page on AppGallery. When we touch the Pay button and enter a password, a black screen is displayed for security purposes. After the payment is successful, we can obtain the payment result. The process is similar for other product types. You can check the demo for details. Next, let's see the code practice on request simulation on your server for IAP. This page shows the APIs related to the Huawei IAP server. We will introduce 2 common APIs as examples. Open the OpenRS server document and obtain the server domain name, that is, root URL. Pay attention to the request body and parameters, including carrier ID and client ID. Carrier ID indicates a carrier ID, and client ID indicates your app ID, which is allocated when your app is created and can be obtained from AppGallery Connect. The request body is mandatory, and its parameter value is a character string. The value of service name to query is defined by each kit. You can also define OAuth AppTouch and Account AppTouch. From the response, you can obtain URLs such as token and token info of AccountKit, as well as the order and subscription of IAP. Now, let's use Postman to simulate a request to obtain the URL required by IAP. First, add the request header and request body based on the document. The request body contains the service names of AccountKit and IAP. The app-level access token will be used later, and we need to request Huawei IAP server, so the service names must contain at least OAuth AppTouch and IAP AppTouch. Now, let's obtain root URL of the request. We can use the global site, China site, or Asian site. Here, the Asian site is used as an example. Then, combine carrier ID and client ID. Here, carrier ID 502 is used to simulate the request. We can obtain the URLs of AccountKit from IAP from the response body. The global URLs of order and subscription are obtained from IAP AppTouch, and the token URLs are obtained from the OAuth AppTouch. These URLs will be used in other APIs and will make it ready in advance. The order and subscription API URLs of AppTouch are provided in the overview of IAP. Currently, the Singapore and Germany sites are provided. The carrier ID is 502, which is an Italian carrier. After comparison, we can see that the order and subscription URLs obtained through the OpenRS server belong to the Germany site. Now that we have obtained the URLs for the order service and subscription service from the OpenRS server, let's first call the two server-side APIs for the order service. First, call the API for verifying a purchase token for the order service. This API will verify the purchase token obtained from the payment result with the IAP server, so as to verify the payment result. Upon successful payment, in-app purchase data will be returned, from which we can obtain data such as a purchase token and product ID. Let's look at the root URL parameter of the API. This URL is the one we have obtained from the order service from the OpenRS server. Since we are interacting with an Italian carrier, the site is Germany. Now we need to pass request parameters. In the request header, two parameters are required. For the authorization parameter, we need to pass an access token. Now we need to obtain an app-level access token by calling a server-side API. As we have mentioned before, the URL of the token in OAuth AppTouch is obtained. Use that URL for root URL. Set grant type to this fixed value, indicating that the client authentication mode is used. That is, an app-level access token is obtained. The other two parameters, client ID and client secret, are obtained from the AppGallery Connect console. You can find the values from Project Settings, General Information, under My Projects. Use the value of client ID for client ID and that of client secret for client secret. Start the postman and configure the request body. Then use the obtained token as root URL to obtain an access token. Now we come back to the API for verifying the purchase token. The request body of this API contains the purchase token and product ID parameters. We need to obtain them in advance. As mentioned before, upon successful payment, in-app purchase data is returned. In our project, obtain the two parameters from the returned data. Next is the authorization parameter. To set it, we need to process the app-level access token based on the rules described here. First of all, suffix the access token with app.at. Then, encode it using base64 with any base64 encoding tool. Lastly, add basic in front of the encoded data as the final value of the authorization parameter. The process seems a little bit complicated, but it is for security purposes. Now we have completed all required parameters for calling the API. Click Send and wait for a response. In response, purchase token data contains data such as the product name, app ID, product type, and encryption algorithm. That's all for this API. Let's move on to the Purchase Confirmation API of the order service. This API will instruct HUAWEI IAP server to update product status when a purchase consumable is successfully delivered. If this API is not called, the consumable cannot be purchased again. This API is similar to the Consume Own Purchase API on the client side. This is the prototype of the API. First, we need to set the value of root URL. For the order service, use the value of the order field obtained from the OpenRS server. Next, set parameters for the request header and request body. Luckily, these parameters are basically the same as those in the Purchase Token Verification API. All we need to do is change the API URL. You can check this demo here for details. Be aware that response parameters are very different from the Purchase Token Verification API. Pay attention to the response message field, which indicates the request result. For example, if the product is not consumed before and is consumed now, consumed success is returned. Open the Postman again. Configure the request header and request body. Change the API URL. In this case, set root URL to the URL of the order service. Then send the request and check the response. In the response code is 0 and response message is consumed success. This means that the API is called successfully and the product is consumed. What if we call this API again after a product is consumed? Let's have a try. Check the response. The response code is 9 and the response message this time is already consumed. That means this product is already consumed and can be purchased again. This is unique for consumables. That is, the consumption API needs to be called to consume the products after they are successfully purchased. Next, I'd like to share with you some frequently asked questions. The first is, are there any differences when using AccountKit or IAP for AppTouch and non-AppTouch businesses? Well, for AppTouch, AccountKit will display the sign-in authorization page provided by the partner carrier instead of that provided by HUAWEI. And for AppTouch, IAP integrated into apps provides payment methods for the partner carrier, for example, by call fee. The second is, what is a carrier ID? A carrier ID indicates the unique channel ID of a carrier. The ID will be used to dynamically obtain the URL of the AccountKit server and that of the IAP server. Third, I have specified the AppTouch channel during app debugging, but the HUAWEI App ID sign-in icon information is still displayed. What do I do? For this, the API for dynamically obtaining the sign-in icon information supports the cache mechanism. That means icon information is obtained from the server only for the first time and then cached in the mobile device cache for later use. You can uninstall the app and install it again to solve the problem. Fourth, the sign-in authorization page and payment page provided by AppGallery instead of AppTouch are displayed. What do I do? The possible cause is that AppTouch is not defined as the default channel for your device. You can change it.
If you want to learn more about AppTouch, visit our website at this URL. If you have any questions or suggestions for us, submit a ticket at this URL. Well, that's all for this course. Thanks for watching and see you next time.